14 years ago, I woke up to a number of new friends on social media who all told me that they found me because of Kristen Bell. And I was like, oh yeah, cool, Kristen. Yeah, she's such a goof, that Kristen, always sending people over here. Of course, 14 years ago, I had no idea who Kristen Bell was.
Motherforking shirtballs.
So it took a minute, but I finally tracked down in all the different notifications the thing that had started all this. I had written a very raw essay that was making the rounds back then, and it was called The Truth About Heroes in Cancer. And one of the people it made its way to was Kristen Bell. And when she commented or shared or whatever it was that she did back then, all she said were two words that I will never forget. Wow, powerful. And those two words were enough to help spread some very important work further out into the world, and I will always really appreciate Kristen for saying them. At the very same time, I wish to every divine force that exists or may have ever existed that none of what led up to it had ever happened. And many days of my life I have spent in a complete daze, a maddened, desperate blur where I'm simply willing reality to be different from the direction my life has actually gone. And the way that people talk about what I went through is what I want to do some good about today. You guys, the way that we talk about things matters. In psychology, there's a term called euphemistic labeling, and it describes the tendency to use softer language to tone down harsh concepts so that they're more palatable. Like when we say that someone has passed away instead of died, and when we say that someone is fighting their illness. So today, I'm bringing the subject of the essay that Kristen Bell liked so much together with the current work that I do on this channel. So stick with me for what is about to be a very important analysis of culture, psychology, linguistics, and what makes us human even in the most desperate of times. In August of 2011, I was diagnosed with cancer. I was 25 years old. There are 18 million cancer survivors walking around in America today. Over 2 million people are diagnosed with cancer in the United States every single year, and 88,000 of those are young adults, or people between the ages of 15 to 39. And 14 years ago, I was one of them. For 3.5 months, I didn't know whether or not I was going to live or if I was going to die. Test after test, things just kept getting worse. It did get me to start some things that I'd been putting off, like I launched a blog and I built a decent following with it, and that got me started writing professionally and working with some cool people at the Huffington Post and the Cancer Research Institute, and I had profiles and interviews and did podcasts and galas and photo shoots. And then somewhere in there, I wrote The Truth About Heroes in Cancer. I wrote it on my blog initially, which I called Zen of Metastasis, and then it was reprinted in the Huffington Post. And it made its way all the way to Kristen Bell. It got me a really nice follower bump. It got me super cool Kristen Bell cred, and it actually led directly to me getting married. It didn't get me married to Kristen Bell, which I have mixed feelings about, and we can talk about that more if anybody wants. But another person who'd come across this essay was my future wife. My now wife. The person I married that I wasn't married to then. So what was The Truth About Heroes in Cancer, and why is it important to our discussion today? The essay was a dark and gritty slap in the face to the Disneyfication of the ways that cancer and terminal illness are portrayed in the media. And maybe it's ironic that a Hollywood actress helped me spread the essay further into the world, because the thing that people miss who write Hollywood scripts about this is that there are no happy endings. When you have the cold hand of the grave wrapped around your ankle, you don't just brush yourself off and walk away clean. And we're always saying things about how people are fighting their cancer. They're fighting for their lives, or they're battling their illness, or they won or they lost their battle. And this is the psychological principle of euphemistic labeling at work. All the way back in 1978, Susan Sontag wrote that using war metaphors in cancer treatment is problematic because it creates an immense emotional burden in the patient. It's been a long time since she published the essays that became known as Illness as Metaphor, doing so while she herself had cancer. And now we have a lot more research and many more data points to pull from about whether or not these kinds of euphemisms are valuable or if they're straight up harmful. In 2022, Robert McEachern wrote in the Journal of Clinical Oncology to advocate for the continued use of war metaphors in cancer treatment. He wrote that doing so gives both patients and oncologists agency. He did a big analysis of language inside published oncology research, and what he found was that they're also riddled with battle language. All the researchers were also using this language. He also described oncology in general as a field where workers must be, quote, donning emotional armor. USC professor Norbert Schwartz and former USC professor now at Queen's University, Ontario, David Hauser, did actual studies about the effects of war metaphors on patient outcomes. They found that bandying about extreme language like this about cancer, which is much more of a prolonged, possibly even chronic journey than a battle, especially these days, all of that lessened a person's likelihood to engage in preventative behavior. What the effects of war metaphor actually does is that it makes people more fatalistic about cancer, treating it as a giant, terrible, decisive battle rather than a genuine health condition that has real risk factors and that can be mitigated and monitored. They also found that none of the marketing or screening PSAs from hospitals that use battle metaphors had any effect on whether or not people went to get screened for cancer. They did find, however, that it increased revenue from fundraising campaigns. What the language does is that it definitely seems to get people motivated to want to donate, which I guess is kind of nice. When asked about how they'd like to see this spoken about instead, they focused on the ideas of encouraging preventative health and pushing realistic goals, and emphasizing the journey aspect of the disease. They wrote that journeys require active engagement, are usually enjoyable, and lead toward a desirable destination. But they also include obstacles and detours along the way, which need to be managed. Such a framing encourages engagement and avoids fatalism while acknowledging potential difficulties. Fortunately, journey metaphors are becoming more popular in this area. One thing that I immediately thought of in response to McEachern's advocacy for continuing to use war metaphors is that he doesn't actually go into why the language is being used or where it may have started in the first place. In my essay that I wrote, I hypothesized that euphemism and disease isn't about empowerment. It's about denial and about creating emotional distance from difficult and dark realities. McEachern does go on to note that such language can be disempowering when things don't go a certain way and when treatments fail. But again, why do we use euphemism about disease at all? Is it about empowering patients and clinicians, or is it about denial? What is it? Some researchers see euphemistic labeling as a kind of deception. Sociobiologist Robert Trivers wrote that deception is, quote, a very deep feature of life. And we do see in the research that there are what appear to be reflexive uses for euphemism across a number of areas of everyday life. Mostly these are places where we've decided that we shouldn't tread in the bright light of day. And these are topics that range from very serious things like death and violence to going to the bathroom. And going to the bathroom is a euphemism too, because you're not just going there. Something's happening when you get there. Sometimes the reasons this happens are kind of sinister, like when politicians use intentionally euphemistic language in order to soften realities that they don't want you to look at. And a 2021 study from Waterloo University found that this kind of use of language lets politicians avoid the cost of lying outright and also helps them to win people over to their side at the very same time. One example pointed out in the study was the phrase enhanced interrogation that's used in place of just saying, torture. And George Orwell talked about this all the way back in 1946 in his essay, Politics in the English Language. He wrote that the great enemy of clear language is insincerity. When there is a gap between one's real and one's declared aims, one turns, as it were, instinctively to long words and exhausted idioms, like a cuttlefish spurting out ink. So what's the gap here? What's the real intention when people are using euphemistic labeling when they're talking about cancer and illness? A 2018 study published in Lexis, the journal in English lexicology, can possibly help us figure that out. The study points out that the word disease itself used to be a euphemism. It comes from Old French and Middle English, where dis means cease and ease means comfortable. So disease is just itself a euphemistic label, which literally means that someone is no longer comfortable. And the original Latin word used to refer to sickness was morbus, but that disappeared because it was way too close to the word for death or corpse, which was mors. Words that replaced it were infirmitus, languor, gravis, and the euphemism male habitus, which led to the French word for illness, malady. The researchers point out that today we're starting to see even further euphemisms like condition instead of disease, and then in French, even softer euphemisms are popping up like un petit problème. Sir, your head is off. Just un petit problème. What is it that we're actually afraid of saying? The Lexis study points out that in the Middle Ages, people were so superstitious about illness that they thought even naming a particular disease would make it possible for them to catch it. And mental illness was for a long time linked to the spiritual world or devilry, and certain kinds of mental illness were seen as demonic or supernatural, and the forces that caused it could also take you over too if you got too close. Disease was often seen as a punishment, especially in the intense religious environments of the time. Epidemics were judgments passed on the population by God himself. The Lexis study points out that a lot of illnesses contain the word evil in their name. Smallpox, for instance, was known as the foul evil, and epilepsy was known as the falling evil. And just like every other area of life, from politics to economics, the one very common thing we see in disease euphemism is to name things by assigning blame to foreigners. While syphilis was once known as Cupid's measles, it quickly turned into terms like Spanish pox, Spanish gout, the disease of Naples, Naples canker, and during the 18th century, it switched focus to France and became the French pox, the French aches, the French malady, and the French marbles. The French marbles! At that point, you were Frenchified if you came down with syphilis. And the truth is, we never really recovered from the intense fear of those times when we didn't know what to make of all of the suffering. It stayed with us even after we began to really understand illness from a more scientific perspective. Even today, the stigma is very strong when it comes to mental illness, for example. And the Lexis study tells us that what we're still euphemistic about really is very much rooted in fear. Cancer, for example, is still fatal in many cases. Mental illness can be very difficult to pin down and treat sometimes, and it's invisible at the same time. You can't see it, and that's very scary. We even have language for all of these things related to disease that imply fear. For example, the phrase worried sick or losing one's mind. Decay, loss of control, and the fear of death. These are things that are still very taboo in polite society. Euphemistic language about them is a form of verbal control. It's a way to keep at bay otherwise infectious language, to name what should not be named. Sontag wrote that any disease that is treated as a mystery and acutely enough feared will be felt to be morally, if not literally, contagious. One book that heavily informed the Lexis research and a ton of other research as well is the 1991 work titled Euphemism and Dysphemism, Language Used as Shield and Weapon. It was written by two linguistics professors from universities in Australia, Keith Allen and Kate Burridge. What they found through their research was that people primarily use euphemism as a means of saving face in front of others. And there are actually tons of studies about this particular element of human social maneuvering. And you're going to recognize it right now as I say it because we're talking about the fact that you speak and act differently depending on who you're interacting with. This is something that linguistics calls style shifting. It's the version of you that you present based on who you're talking to. And the Lexis study authors point out three separate motivating factors for using disease euphemism in a social setting, and we're going to talk about two of those. The first is exactly that. It's about saving face. They write that it's a desire to be more polite or impolite/humorous, which they call a face-flattering act or a face-threatening act. The other motivation that's important here is that euphemism in this setting could create a sense of collective identity that both people belong to manifest sort of an in-group and put yourselves in it and exclude others from it. Like if you're both afflicted with the same condition. If you both have the French marbles. Un petit problème. This is just a little problem. Ugh. So what we're really talking about when we talk about euphemism is the idea of making yourself fit into your current space and your current audience in an appropriate way. It's a sociological urge to belong and to then express that belonging. But it doesn't always come across in a positive light, as we've seen from some of the other research that we've already covered. Some people get very upset about things like battle euphemism in talking about cancer, and I was one of those people back in the day, and I guess I'm still one of them. I'm not really upset about it anymore, and I'm not mad, I'm just disappointed. If you ask me, if there's anything resembling a battle about having cancer, then it's Vonnegut's representation of battle from Slaughterhouse-Five. It's like this absurdist, dispassionate reporting on autonomous systemic forces that are happening to you, in which you yourself are so lost in the face of the enormity of life's immense, unfeeling cruelty that you simply become delusional. And then the crushing trauma of living like this will have lasting, unavoidable effects downstream of your life that will touch every part of your existence. And one of the most notorious examples of disease euphemism comes from the Sick Kids Foundation. The Sick Kids Foundation is the fundraising arm of the Toronto Hospital for Sick Children. And in 2016, they launched an ad campaign that featured kids with cancer as boxers, knights, and one kid had like this giant meaty guy inside him. I don't know what that's about. And I'm actually really glad that I somehow didn't see this at the time, because it's fucking awful. It won awards though, like people went crazy about it. And from looking into the research, it seems to me that social media just being another form of sociological identity expression, I think that people enthusiastically grasp onto and celebrate this kind of euphemism in order to signal that they're involved somehow in the struggle. They care, or they want to be perceived as if they do. And that's the actual identity that they're putting out. Because if you do that publicly, then you don't have to do anything for anyone that really matters. I mean, that's a cynical take, but it does maybe jive with the research about how we use euphemism in order to simply save face with others. And I understand that I'm the king of the island of misfit toys, and I am an outlier in this and in many things. I don't like euphemism, and I don't like what Trivers called a necessary deception. He said that euphemism is vital to the social fabric, and I'm the kind of person who writes essays that make people feel bad for trying to be enmeshed in that social fabric. So what can we actually agree on that would help in this case? Instead of telling your neighbor going through chemo that they should just, fight harder, there are some real things you can do to make a difference, so that we can do some good about the way that we treat people with cancer in America and around the globe. First off, you can just ask them how they'd like to be spoken to. For this, you'd have to shift your mentality from a reflexive, reptilian sort of brainstem mechanism of social masking to like an actual intelligent and empathetic sense of discovery about someone. Signaling that you care about someone can be as easy as actually caring about them, and then fighting the instinct to just fit in with something that you think is expected of you. So that's one, and I think it's a big one. And then there are the practical things, the super useful logistical things. You can drive someone to their appointments. You can sit with someone while they're in the chemo chair getting their infusions. That is one of the loneliest, saddest points in the entirety of someone's existence. You can bring them food. Because one thing that someone with cancer doesn't have a lot of is energy. And cooking is usually one of the very last things on their mind. Gifting someone prepared food when they're in any kind of stressful situation is a trope for a reason. It's helpful. It should be paired with genuine curiosity and real care about their situation, and not just used as another shielding tactic or some kind of avoidance, or again, a social cue that you care so that you don't actually have to care. Another thing you can do is just hang out. One of the biggest things that happened to me when I was going through treatment was that I became pretty agoraphobic. After my surgeries were done, I did a year of old school immunotherapy called interferon alpha 2b, and it just completely broke me. I spent a year on the couch in a Snuggie. My family and my doctors threw me a Snuggie intervention. There was nothing brave or battle-oriented about any of that. And if you ask me now, I'll tell you I was a failure. And there are a great many days where I can't shake that feeling still. Because a lot of the time I couldn't bring myself to go outside, let alone just get off the couch. And then sometimes people came to see me and I had to pretend to know how to do social stuff again. For me, it was painful, but I feel like if it had happened maybe a bit more often, or if I had more practice at it, then maybe I could have felt like a person again. And then there were the people who sent me things, and that was really cool. I had a good friend whose wife worked at DC, and they sent me a big stack of comics of all different kinds. And then I had my core group of friends that I've known forever, and they would come over and we'd play games, and things would be just normal again. And that's important. Showing someone who's going through something awful that isn't all there is to life anymore. Because sometimes that's very much what it feels like. I wanted to talk about this idea of euphemistic labeling and also how writing this essay back then explains a lot of what I'm doing here on this channel. It really illustrates a core concept of my work in general. Most of the books I've written have been about the exact same thing, whether fiction or nonfiction, and this is the morbid curiosity of what happens when the extreme realities of life push someone all the way past the edge. I think about the fact that life itself can simply discard someone, and that's just a foreign idea to a lot of us. The level of devastation that some face on a daily basis would simply break the brains of a lot of everyday people. And I wanted to examine what it means to be the person who's discarded, who's broken, who's left to try to wake up in the morning and just live another day. And then I wanted to talk about how that person sees others relating to them as they're moving through the world. And the niceties and the politeness that comes out of fear of encountering that person. And I just feel like we need to think about that more. Because illness and aging and decay is a part of life. A big part of life. And most of the time, we don't engage with it until we get there ourselves. Because one of the extreme ironies of the human condition is our ability to engage intellectually with all kinds of varieties of experiences, but we have a complete inability to really understand them unless we personally experience those things and emotionally engage with them. So if you know someone who's going through something very difficult right now, whether it be illness or grief or something else entirely, then focus on fighting through instinct and just try to engage and talk to them how they want to be talked to. And find some practical things that help to show them how you care. And don't think about what other people may see or think. And don't blame illnesses on people from other countries. What is that? French marbles. I'll give you the French marbles. I won't. Actually, I'm married. And don't forget, make sure to like and subscribe so that you can find out what I'm doing next time. It's going to be just as weird, probably. And don't worry, Kristen, I won't tell anyone it was you who gave me the French marbles. Not a single soul. Not ever. Not now or in the future or not even under enhanced interrogation.